for the entirety of the academic year, Keck Humanities Fellows work under the close guidance of a faculty advisor to conduct original substantial research, scholarly activities, and or creative work, all of which advance the interdisciplinary humanities in really important ways. So this year, I had the, I'm Josen Diaz, by the way, faculty in ethnic studies and chair of the collaborative research program here at the Humanities Center. So this year, I had the immense privilege of working with and learning from 6 Keck Fellows whose work in the interdisciplinary humanities, I think, represents the very best of undergraduate research at USD. So to that end, I want to thank Brian Clack and Lindy Villa for their instrumental support for the Keck program. I also want to thank Jesse Mills, who helped to usher in this cohort, to Atre Fukan and Amanda Makula, who met with the fellows during our monthly meetings that I'm sure all of you really, really loved. Just kidding. To the faculty advisors who helped guide the fellows for the entire year through the arduous process that we all know of research and writing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And to the fellows themselves for easily, again, being the very best part of this program. So for our first session, I'd like to introduce Anna, Bryson, and Claire, who are going to start us off with their really wonderful projects. And so first off, I'll go ahead and introduce Anna. Is it on?
Let's see. Magic. Good afternoon. My name is Anna Salvestrin. I'm a senior honors student with a major in theology and religious studies, and I'm a Keck Fellow presenting my research titled Cultivating Compassion in Catholic Teachings, an Invitation to Relationship with Immigrants and Refugees with HIV and AIDS. In 2020, 38 million people were living with HIV, and almost 700,000 people died of AIDS-related complications. Immigrants and refugees are particularly vulnerable when it comes to HIV. They are having to uproot their lives, go to a new country, trying to establish their basic needs, and this can come with some difficulties in accessing their healthcare, receiving the medication, and housing and support that they need. The conversation of HIV and AIDS has been supported by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops since 1989, when they released a document titled Call to Compassion and Responsibility. The USCCB, or the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, has been supporting social justice efforts in the United States since 1917, when they were founded. It is their goal to help immigrants, aid in education, and support Catholic activities in the United States through publications. Their work and their publications are widely respected on the parish and the diocese level. So back to the document I previously mentioned, Call to Compassion and Responsibility, addressed the HIV crisis in the United States. It was the goal of the document to enhance compassion for those who are sick, while also encouraging personal and social responsibility to mitigate the spread of HIV. There are 3 sections in this document that I focus on in my research. First, call to compassion, a call to responsibility, and then a call to social justice. Under the call to social justice, there's a subsection specifically for care for immigrants and refugees. This subsection is shocking, considering that this is a 34-page document, yet this is all they wrote, 2 sentences. Considering that this is a vulnerable population deserving of more care and attention, this is all they could provide. The 2 sentences that are included here discuss the travel ban that was in place that kept HIV-positive immigrants from entering into the United States. But in 2010, President Obama repealed that ban, and the suggestions of the bishops were met. Well, unfortunately, now in 2020, there are no relevant recommendations for care for HIV-positive immigrants and refugees. In my research, I argue that the document's recommendations do not adequately consider the experiences of immigrants and refugees with HIV and AIDS, and neglect sufficient attention to their lived experiences. I will be using this presentation to argue that providing more attention to lived experiences will better meet the document's goals of achieving compassion and responsibility. I will briefly explain my research methods before diving into a deeper understanding of compassion. And then I will explain how lived experience also informs personal and social responsibility. Then, following the format of the document, I'll be providing parish action and critique government policies. Let us begin with my research methods. So after I identified my research problem, I began my literature review, which included a comprehensive web search, reviewing past class syllabi and those reading lists, and then also using the Copley Library databases to gain peer-reviewed journal articles. Overall, I was able to gather a variety of sources that included books, journals, web pages, and church documents. Beginning with the first section of the document, I would like to highlight how the bishops define compassion. Compassion is much more than sympathy. It involves an experience of intimacy in which one participates in another's life. It involves an experience of intimacy by which one participates in another's life. What the bishops are saying here is that compassion demands relationship. You cannot have compassion for another person unless you are engaged with their lived experiences. This can be further understood through the concept of relational distance. The closer the friendship you have with someone, the closer the relationship, the more likely you are to care for their well-being and their life. But the farther removed you are from their life and their life stories, the more likely we are to turn them into abstract objects and things not deserving of the care that they need. So when it comes to immigrants who are HIV positive, it is important to bring their stories and lived experiences to the forefront to encourage compassion and diminish relational distance. Furthermore, being in relationship helps reveal imago Dei, or the image of God. Catholics believe that every human was created in the image and likeness of God. And when we are in relationship with people, that allows us to better reflect on this concept. We can see that by reflecting on the lives of immigrants who are HIV positive, we can develop a deeper understanding of who God is through their lives. And this helps us develop and nurture love and compassion. Similarly, with understanding responsibility, lived experience also has an impact. In the document, the bishops focus on two forms of responsibility: personal and social responsibility. Beginning with personal responsibility, it's how individuals act to stop or prevent the spread of HIV. Lived experiences can encourage personal responsibility by facilitating vicarious learning. We have seen this model be successful at the San Diego LGBTQ Center. What they offer is peer-to-peer led support groups for HIV positive people, where a mentor is able to relate their lived experiences to their mentees, and the mentees can then learn from their mentors' experiences, their mistakes, and their successes in their HIV journey. That can teach the mentees then how to be more responsible for their own lives. Further, social responsibility is how we act as a community to help facilitate the common good. As Father Greg Boyle wrote in his book, Tattoos on the Heart, it is no longer us versus them. It is only us. When you go into relationship with someone, you become invested in their well-being, and you want to contribute to the common good because you start to understand that your human dignity is tied to their human dignity as well. By listening to marginalized peoples, specifically HIV positive immigrants, communities can become more caring, inclusive, and responsible to one another. Moving into the second half of my presentation, I would like to talk about how these concepts can be implemented into parish action and government policy. First of all, in the document, the bishops do not provide any concrete parish action for caring for immigrants and refugees with HIV, even though they do provide parish action in other sections. So I decided to create my own action steps that churches can implement. First, participation. I included this photo of Founders Chapel because University Ministry previously hosted monthly trips to an HIV/AIDS hospice in Tijuana, Mexico. This was an opportunity for undergraduate and graduate students to be in relationship with the residents while learning about the intersection between HIV and immigration. That was the best way to live out these concepts that we're talking about abstractly today, to go forth to the margins and learn and to be in community. Students would return month after month and help facilitate these trips for other students. And it was a fantastic way for students to build community with the residents of the hospice. I encourage university ministry to start this program again when it is safe to do so due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, education. Parishes should be a place for education rather than shame. This means that clergy and parishioners should analyze their personal biases and focus on sharing accurate and helpful information. What this could look like is churches providing a list of community resources, such as local medical providers, support groups, or immigration attorneys. For immigrants that are new to the community and who are struggling with HIV, this can help them to feel more welcomed and supported by their church community. Finally, prayer. Prayer is central to Catholic life, and especially the practice of communal prayer. One way churches can practice this is through an HIV/AIDS memorial quilt. This is inspired by the AIDS memorial quilt. In 1996, this AIDS quilt was last displayed. Each panel represents someone's life who was lost to AIDS. Parishes can take on a similar project, just on a smaller scale. Families can create quilt squares that represent and recognize the struggles that come with being HIV positive and also the struggles of immigration. The quilt that is built together, that is put together by this community, can then be displayed in the parish to remind everyone to hold the marginalized and the sick in their daily prayer. Moving on to government policy, I would like to address the Remain in Mexico order and the harm it causes to HIV positive asylum seekers. Instated in 2019 by President Trump, the Remain in Mexico order states that asylum seekers must wait in Mexico until the US immigration courts process their claims. In June 2021, President Biden repealed this order, stating it was inhumane and dangerous. Yet, 6 months later, the policy was reinstated and it is still in place today. The Remain in Mexico order forces people to wait in Mexico for months, if not years. And for those with HIV, this can mean that they are not receiving the proper health care, medication, nutrition, and housing that they need. Problems such as these, caused by US immigration policy, puts all asylum seekers, but especially HIV positive asylum seekers, at risk and denies their human dignity. A more flexible and humane government policy seems necessary. To recap what I've talked about today, call to compassion and responsibility neglects the lived experiences of immigrants and refugees with HIV and AIDS. But by developing relationship and listening to lived experiences, we can better meet the document's goals of addressing compassion and responsibility, which can better inform parish action and government policy. I would like to leave you with this quote from Pope Francis's recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. Each of us can learn something from others. No one is useless and no one is expendable. This also means finding ways to include those on the peripheries of life, for they have another way of looking at things. They see aspects of reality that are invisible to the centers of power. Going further, I encourage you to build relationships with unexpected people. Reach out to the marginalized and care for the sick. Each of us is capable of extending a hand to those in need, so let us not forget those who have been pushed aside. Thank you very much. Special thanks to Dr. Carmona, my advisor, and Dr. Diaz and Lindy as well. Thank you.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. My name is Bryson Patterson. I'm an environmental science and poli-sci major here at USD. This is my senior year, so very excited to be moving on, staying here to do my master's. So not going very far. The title of my presentation today and the topic of the last year of my life has been Capturing the Polar Sublime, Burke, Balke, and Photography. So my journey into the sublime began where you guys are all sitting today. Almost 2 years ago, I was enrolled in this Humanities Center course with Drs. O'Shea and Dr. Clack, and I was learning what color my pee should look like for our upcoming Death Valley trip. A few days later, I was unfortunately driving home for an unknown amount of time because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But thankfully, right after that, I was back on the road, the summer of COVID. Thankfully, right after that, I was back on the road, having taken advantage of that time online instead of out in the desert to learn all about the sublime and dive deeper into the book than we were originally expecting to. I took those new lessons out on the road, starting in Nevada, moving on to Utah, then up to Oregon, up to Washington, and eventually back home. So what exactly was I chasing? What is the sublime? In his 1757 treatise, seen here, titled A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, Burke sought to recapture what he believed the true definitions of beautiful and sublime to be. Focusing on the sublime, we see here that Burke defines it as whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger. That is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects. He goes on. What he's getting at here is that the most powerful emotion anybody can experience is pain, particularly bodily pain. All you seek to do in your life is to continue living. So anything that plays to that point is extremely threatening to you. However, if it is removed at such a distance that you can start to enjoy it, it then becomes pleasurable. This is what Burke defines as the sublime. Some key tenets of that are obscurity, terror, power, vastness, and infinity. Burke's writing helped kick off the Romantic period. This is a period in artistic literature, art, and music that started in the end of the 18th century and moved on into the early 19th century. Some key aspects of Romanticism are the focus on nature, emotion, and the infinite. Those should be pretty familiar from the last slide. The literature of the Romantic period focused on a lot of what Burke was talking about with nature. Noted Romantic period poet William Wordsworth focused on the mutual domination of nature, going on to call it sublime. Samuel Coleridge began to focus on the ice of nature in his Rime of the Ancient Mariner poem. You can see here, he talks about the ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. And he describes the cracking and the growling that it made upon the ship. Despite her mother's hatred of Burke, Mary Shelley filled Frankenstein with quotes from the sublime, using it directly 7 times and describing all of Switzerland and the Alps, using the language directly from Burke. Finally, writing on vacation with Shelley in that summer, Lord Byron talks about the cold sublimity and the icy halls of the Alps that they saw from their lake cabin. The art of the Romantic period focused on similar traits. Here we see a painting by J.M.W. Turner. You can see kind of the ferocity of nature and the overpowering of the sea upon the small ship. Likewise, in the raft of the Medusa, you can see the hopelessness of all the people aboard. When this painting was first displayed, it was originally held up above the audience. However, once the artist experienced that for the first time, he went to have it lowered and had a large ovular mirror installed behind it. So when you were done viewing it and turned around, you were, instead of seeing your exit, you were seeing yourself enveloped in the painting. If you haven't been fortunate enough to see this painting, it is extremely large and it's hung nice and low in the Louvre. So you get up close to it and you're absolutely terrified. Moving on to my favorite Romantic period artist, Caspar David Friedrich. You see here, perhaps what encapsulates Burke's sublime the most. You see a man alone in the infinite wilderness over an obscured valley. However, for the purposes of my research, I was much more interested in Caspar David Friedrich's painting on the ice. This is called The Sea of Ice. In it, you can see the crushing of the ice upon the ship, building up. In the North and South Poles, this is called pack ice. However, Caspar David Friedrich only did his studies on a little river near where he lived and was not able to go and see what this looked like in person. The sublime in contemporary discussion has kind of reduced from where it was when Burke first introduced it. You can see in the graph in the bottom, begins at 1700, sees a large climb up in 1750, all the way through the Romantic period, and a decline way down here. You can see it is just now starting to become slightly more popular in discussion. Emily Brady, in her essay in this book titled Environmental Sublime, discusses some reasons that the sublime may have fallen out of favor. Two of them are the technological and scientific conquering of nature. On the point of the technological conquering of nature, this just means it is no longer something that can threaten us. We have a phone with us everywhere we go. We can call our parents if we get scared on a mountain. We're in a much more comfortable place now than we were when these people were experiencing nature. However, the scientific conquering of nature, I think, is a worse point as we go on to learn more about science. Instead of kind of pulling back the veil on mystery, I believe that we are increasing the veil. We learn more of what we don't know. That's kind of touched on in these books. This is 2 books from the Reaction series. It's a series of books about the sublimity of nature and a variety of landscapes. In the introduction to the one on glaciers, Peter Knight writes that the only true voyage of discovery consists not in exploring new places, but in seeing through new eyes. There he's quoting Marcel Proust. So he's not saying that there is a destination to be discovered and then you are done. There are a variety of ways of seeing everything, and that just continues to make it more interesting. These books do a wonderful job of taking the centuries-old idea of the sublime into the present and using our scientific tools to heighten the sensation instead of reducing it. During my research, I was continuously drawn to the polar sublime. We originally planned on having two parts to my paper. We were going to focus on the poles and ice and the desert. However, I couldn't stop reading these books. They're just the stories from the landscapes and the expeditions are incredibly sublime. It lends itself perfectly to Burke's writing. The poles are infinite, they're vast, they're absolutely unconquered. And at the time that these people were exploring them, they were largely unknown and unmapped. Highlighting a few of the expeditions, all of which are extremely sublime, those explorers that were able to come back, usually came back with harrowing tales, and those that were not able to come back usually left behind mysteries for those that followed to solve. Looking at the Endurance, an image of which you see on the left, this is Shackleton's trip to the South Pole, where his ship was completely crushed by the ice, similar to that painting that you saw from Caspar David Friedrich a century earlier. Moving on down to Amundsen, Nansen, and the Fram. The Fram was the ship that Amundsen and Nansen took to both poles, first to the North Pole, and then in kind of a tricky move to the South Pole. I was fortunate enough this past Easter to actually go see the ship of the expeditions. I've highlighted here the Endurance, the Fram, and the Terror and Erebus. This is the only ship that ever actually made it back. So it's in a museum in Oslo right now, and it's absolutely fantastic. You're able to stand on the deck and they display in 270 degrees what it would be like to be in a storm on top of that ship. It's terrifying, it's sublime. And in this last instance, you see the Terror and the Erebus. This is the epitome of leaving behind a mystery. The Terror and the Erebus disappeared on an expedition to find the Northwest Passage. And only recently have we even begun to try or to even sort of figure out what happened to them, although it is largely unknown. This goes to my research question. We know that these stories are sublime. We know that the art they produce is fantastic, but is photography a sufficient medium for capturing and conveying the feelings of this natural sublime? I'm going to argue yes. However, some critics of the sublime being portrayed in art raise the point that it exists merely within a frame. How can you be terrified of something that you can stand over? In her essay on the environmental sublime, Emily Brady quotes Ronald Hepburn saying, "We are in nature and a part of nature. We do not stand over against it as over against a painting on a wall." He goes on to explain that because these paintings exist in the frame, we are aware of their boundaries and they're not able to offer anything mysterious to us that could then become terrifying and subsequently sublime. Burke in his book, argues that literature is an extremely good way of conveying the sublime. He doesn't outright say that art isn't perfect, but the points he raises for literature simply don't apply to art. He says that literature is capable of planting a seed in your head that you can then use your imagination to fill out the rest of the bounds. That's not something that's possible in painting. However, I'm going to point out some aspects of the polar sublime and their representation in art, and then highlight a polar artist, and finally move on to my own photography. So you remember this painting from earlier. Now that you're slightly more familiar with how ships get crushed and men get lost in the Arctic, you might think it's a little bit more enjoyable. This painting by Caspar David Friedrich, again, was done, however, from the comfort of his home, never having gone this far north. This painting, slightly more terrifying, is a painting that highlights just how merciless the nature, both animal and ocean, are to those people that find themselves unfortunate enough to be without their larger ship and stuck moving in a life raft. Again, by the same artist, if you can't see it, this painting highlights what happens after your ship gets crushed in the ice, as you can see down here on the left. Moving farther over, you can see some men, one remaining alive, 3 frozen dead around him, and their tracks having tried to find a way out, all while the northern lights dance overhead. This is a completely merciless and unforgiving landscape, both then and now, and it's captured exquisitely in these paintings. This brings me to the artist that I was most interested in. This painting you see here on the left caught my attention 2 years ago. Actually, right before that very first class, I was fortunate enough to be in Europe. I was up in the Louvre and I saw this painting, and I knew I was going to be reading a book about fascinating landscapes for this class, so I took a picture of it. I didn't know I'd be returning years later just to try and find who the artist was. I only took a picture of the painting, and that made it very difficult to track it down. But the artist I'm extremely interested in is Peter Balke. So he is a Norwegian landscape artist, relatively obscure, born at the beginning of the 19th century and died toward the end of it. The bulk of his work focuses on what you see here, this Finnmark expedition in 1832. This was an expedition he took up past the Arctic Circle. Finnmark is in the northernmost part of Norway, up past the Arctic Circle to try and see what the landscape was like for himself. He would be the first romantic painter to do so, and what he brought back was fantastic. Writing about his journey up to the north, Peter Balke says, "Nor is any pen capable of describing the grandiose and enchanting impression made on the eye and the mind by the wealth of natural beauty and the incomparable situations, an impression that not only overwhelmed me then and there in the intoxication of the moment, but also had a decisive influence on my whole life. For in these northern districts, the beauty of nature takes the leading role, while human beings, the children of nature, play only a secondary role." He was not exaggerating this obsession that he had. He would go on to almost exclusively paint for the rest of his life scenes that he saw on this journey. Highlighting some of his paintings. First, we see here from a more southerly port, the power of the ocean and the rising mountains behind on his journey up to the north. Next, we see here my personal favorite painting. Moving farther up the coast, Peter Balke painted what are called the Seven Sisters, deep in mythology that he would have been comfortable with at the time. Next, you see here, painting in the far north, a picture of a Sami person. Next, you see what captured him the most. This is called the North Cape, what was thought to be the northernmost point in Europe at the time. This is what Peter ended up painting dozens of paintings of. You see another representation here, yet another here. Moving on later in life, he painted scenes more local, more familiar to the people that he would be more able to sell his artwork to. However, that never took off. And when he returned to painting what he loved most, he just painted for himself until he died, scenes that you recognize from the earlier paintings. So what does photography offer as a medium? I think what we may enjoy most from Peter Balke's work is that we know that he was there experiencing that. Learning that Caspar David Friedrich had never been to the north, never seen anything like that happen to a ship, may take away a bit from that painting. However, it's very difficult to fool an audience with photography. It's possible, but I think it offers some sort of factual evidence that something occurred that then lends to its sublimity. Here you see a photo of a galaxy. If this were a painting, you would think that it was kind of a strange painting full of a bunch of dots. But if you know that it's a galaxy billions of light years away, you become more intrigued by it. You probably enjoy it more. Again, if you saw a painting of an orange waterfall, you would probably think it's a little ridiculous. But if you know that it's a photograph of an event that only occurs for a brief amount of time each year, only when the conditions are absolutely perfect, you probably think it's way cooler. Photography was huge for these polar expeditions. For some of the later expeditions, it was in part how they financed their journeys. Shackleton and Nansen, both, when faced with death, still made sure to keep their photos, keep the frames, keep the negatives. Here you see Shackleton's ship, moments before it sinks, stranding 20+ men on a journey that is surely to lead in doom. Much more moving than the Caspar David Friedrich painting now. This brings me to my own photography. Over Easter, I was fortunate enough to be able to go to Norway, go to Tromsø, which was the last port Balke and a lot of these explorers stopped at on their way to the poles. Briefly, because I'm running out of time, I'm going to show you some of my favorite photographs that I think capture the landscape and its sublimity. It was an incredible place, and you can see how it motivated both explorers and artists alike. However, I want to leave you with one of my favorite photos that was not from this journey. This is not one of my most technically sound photos. However, it is the one that I feel embodies the sublime the most. We know from Balke that knowing the story behind both the artist and the scene in which they were placed makes for the art significantly more interesting. In this picture, you can see what was the result of days of planning of trying to find this comet over Mount St. Helens in the morning. However, what was not planned was what you see in the foreground, all these lit up trees. I was standing there terrified on top of this mountain alone, and an elk went running by between my tent and I. So this is me shining my flashlight around, freaking out before I went and called my parents. What I want to leave you all with today is that a little piece of what I have gotten from this work over the last 2 years of my life. I have used the language of the sublime both to enhance my experiences with it and convey how I feel to my friends. It has become something that I'm absolutely obsessed with, and you can see all the places that it has brought me out. I hope a little piece of this convinces you guys to maybe go outside a little bit more, go see some of these emotions for yourselves, go stand outside in a thunderstorm, be scared, and then be able to walk back inside or call your parents. You're going to enjoy it all a whole lot more. So thank you so much.
So my name is Bryanna Rivas. I'm a theology and religious studies major, as well as a philosophy major. My project is called Revisioning Imago Dei. It explores the intersections between gender expression, the Catholic conception of God, and material culture. So just to kind of overview what my presentation will be like, I'll start with an overview of what theological aesthetics is and how I use that to kind of frame my research. And then I'll talk about different perspectives on gender expression from feminist philosophers, feminist theologians, as well as a wide variety of other scholars. And then I will go into a conversation about Imago Dei, what that means in terms of having a gendered embodiment and what it means with representations of God, how we use that to form our own self-conception. And then I'll discuss material culture in the Catholic tradition. Material culture is art, but more broadly, everything that includes art. So textile, dress, music, every part of the Catholic tradition, from sculpture, from scripture to what makes smaller Catholic communities connected. And then I will continue with implications. So what connects all these ideas? What does this mean for the Catholic community? And then what does this mean going forward? So just to overview, I came to connecting all of these ideas by just thinking about gender expression and gender identity, and what that means given a largely gendered God. So in my theology and philosophy classes, a lot of my discussion in specific classes has been like, how do we go beyond gender norms and gender restrictions when our vision of God is so gendered? So my research is built on exploring the intersections between gender identity, the nature of God, and the execution of gender expression in art. And I do bridge the works of feminist philosophers and feminist theologians. It just so happens that a lot of work on gender expression and identity is done by scholars who are coming from a feminist perspective. And I'm using this framework to make a theological assertion that the incarnational existence of God should aim to transcend the social and historical gender roles. Doing so opens or enhances humans to better understand the meaning of God, as well as understand the place of humans as imago Dei. And all of this is aimed toward better representing the fullness of the divine, theologically as well as artistically. So how can this help change or shift how we literally envision what God is? And how is this engagement possible by, in some ways, detracting from materiality, but also further engaging with materiality? So just an overview of what theological aesthetics is as a field. It's a framework to approach theological work and find deeper meaning. It is kind of a wide umbrella term, but it can include using formal aesthetic assessments to make theological assessments. It also just engages the creative side of humans and acknowledges that humans don't do theology just by writing and reading. It happens through art and expression. And I believe it is more inclusive of the spiritual experience that humans encounter. This is the Black Madonna. She's a popular representation of the Virgin Mary. And this is just one example of a painting of her. This particular painting is in the Vatican Museum inventory, so it's not on display. It's kind of hidden away in a closet. But should this painting or other paintings like it be more front and center, it could dramatically shift how we view these theological figures and then how we view ourselves. So the art of making theological discourse affecting and beautiful, theoposis, is appropriate to all branches and kinds of theology. So while theological aesthetics engages in the material world, that's so we can further engage in our humanity. And it points to an importance of all like human endeavors. So I'll go into gender expression. A lot of the work that I've done in reading feminist philosophers and feminist theologians, there's surprisingly quite a few similarities in terms of these ideas, but coming from different perspectives of theology and philosophy. One common theme is the body as socialized history. So Judith Butler has this neat little paper where she comments on Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir is also kind of a classic feminist philosopher. So Simone de Beauvoir asserts that there's a separation of what the body is, everything that the body can do, and what gender is. Gender is a kind of historical weight that the body carries. And so with this, Judith adds on to Simone's commentary and says that this binary system of having male and female bodies with male and female genders has no metaphysical permanence. In this cool little article, she goes through like the history of gender roles, basically just to point out that there's nothing metaphysically permanent about this, and that our bodies are essentially blank slates for us to use and not conform to gender roles. So similar to this, many feminist theologians have similar ideas. Rosemary Radford Ruther writes frequently about a non-duality. So in Platonic philosophy, dualism is nature versus culture, reason versus emotion, and this distinction also can be whittled down to feminine versus masculine. Ruther describes how this, as applies to God, is quite literally harmful to women, or just non-male identifying people, because it automatically asserts a hierarchy. So Ruther asserts that holding a non-dualist perspective will allow non-male identifying people to further engage with the divine, but for all people, it will create a better vision of what the divine is. Another popular feminist theologian, Mary Daly, she was a prolific writer on feminist theology. Her writings were very important during the 70s. She also asserts that this binary system has no metaphysical permanence. And given the history of women as the second sex, women are called to be the bearers of existential courage to confront nothingness. So when she says nothingness, she is referencing Paul Tillich, who is another theologian and uses nothingness to describe the nature of God. And it's not a nothingness in the strictly nihilistic sense, but it's a nothingness that allows the search for deeper meaning. So Mary Daly asserts that women are best apt to confront this, given social hierarchy, and that once this is confronted, it will help the Catholic imagination as a whole, and allow all people to better engage with the divine. Another popular quote that she has is, "If God is male, then male is God," which just kind of drives home the point of how deeply a gendered God will affect our world. So continuing with the idea of metaphysical embodiment, as I mentioned earlier, Judith Butler will assert the body as a blank canvas that carries a weight that has no metaphysical permanence. So in order to kind of relieve ourselves of this weight, we have to reject like social history and the material world to better understand the meaning of who we are in relation to our bodies. This is related to Hegel's freedom of the void, which is a bit more nihilistic, but it can be basically whittled down to the only free thing is a person's personality. So being able to reject the social history that your body has, and then coming back and engaging with the material through like art and your gender expression. I believe this is a good starting point to discuss the gendered nature of God. So going into Imago Dei, similar to stepping back from materiality and releasing it, if we look at Imago Dei from an apophatic sense, which is a negative theology and eliminating what we think God is, and then carrying over to epicynity, which is androgyny, or the freedom from gender. So beginning in Genesis, is kind of how humans get this vision of Imago Dei, where we're made in the image and likeness of God. And that statement is clear and is applicable to all humans. But in the Catholic tradition, we use gendered language to describe God, while also ironically giving God masculine and feminine traits. So being kind of a nurturer and literally a life giver while still being seen as a father. It creates some gender confusion. However, it doesn't really get to being truly androgynous because it is so heavily weighted on the masculine side. And the Catholic tradition does play into some of the Platonic duality that Ruther wants to get away from. And again, going back to Hegel's void and connecting it with Paul Tillich's nothingness, seeing the divine as a complete mystery is not a sign that we should not engage with the divine or seek meaning, but it is rather a sign that humans made in the image of God are also limitless, and exploring this kind of limitless will offer us endless meaning. And so this, just one example, is Christa. It was made in 1984, and it's Jesus with crucified. He has breasts. It was taken down immediately after it was put up, but it has been reinstated in 2016. And so when looking at texts of the lives of saints, androgyny was something that actually meant, it was common in the lives of saints and meant that these people were closer to being divine. They were closer to being unified with the divine, but a scholar of rhetoric, Christina Sidio, identifies these stories as rhetorical androgyny and says that within all these stories, male saints have an easier time achieving this divine unity because they're already perceived to have masculine and some feminine qualities. But there's a major imbalance with allowing female saints to achieve divine unity. So why does representation matter, and what does this have to do with material culture? Again, material culture is art, including paintings, sculpture, dress, music. So like Mary Daly says, symbols are historical, and like the feminist philosophers we read, bodies are historical. So within the Catholic Church, there are many motifs and symbols that reinforce the historical and traditional norms. Mary Daly says the destruction of such idols are essential to transforming what Imago Dei means. And as Judith Butler says, matter matters. So when we look at art, it's not, it does have an impact on what we think of ourselves and how we conceive divine. So this again is another example of Christ, who is also supposed to be like God incarnate, and is the clearest example of God in a body. So another example by an anonymous artist of Christ with boobs, or Christ with breasts. And it's just leaning into the feminine qualities of the divine. So as part of my research, I kind of wanted to focus on or try and land on dress. When thinking about gender identity, dress is the first thing you put on your skin. It's right next to your body, and it's fundamentally an extension of your gender identity and your embodiment. So in some examples of the lives of saints in medieval times, androgyny was shown through either concealing the body, simply wearing particular vestments or clothes that indicate you are either male or female. But again, that points to the non-metaphysical permanence of being male or female. And I explored a bit the church vestments. There's a long and very interesting history of church vestments. So one example I will show you is the mitre, which is a crown that bishops and archbishops wear. It comes from the Greek word mitra. It means band. In the 8th century, the Pope just kind of needed a hat. And so the first mitres are like very simplistic, a gold band and like a white cap. They didn't even cover the whole head. But by the 12th century, it was horned, and later the horns became triangular, so it looks like this. From the 14th century to the 17th century was the most opulent. So these mitres literally became taller, more ornate, and had steeper sides. They were meant to emphasize the power that a bishop or archbishop has. They were also meant to literally change the way your body looks and alter your form and your body. So this is an example of a 15th century mitre. It's in the Museum of St. January in Naples. And then this is an example of Bryanna, who wore a mitre at the Met Gala in 2018, designed by Maison Margiela. Her simply wearing a mitre, even though it's not, her hat is not officially a mitre, it caused quite a controversy because this is a symbol of power, but it's also a symbol of your gender identity. So seeing a woman, especially a popular woman, wear a mitre was a statement against this traditional norms of dress. So for implications on all of these different topics, basically all of the intersections between these issues are gender-based power dynamics that dictate the theological and creative makeup of the Catholic Church. There exists a material and heavenly hierarchy that's reinforced through material culture and art. Mary Daly's quote, "If God is male, then male is God," can't be changed until symbols, art, and language are confronted. And these pose present limits for the search for meaning and genuine engagement with the self as imago Dei. And just looking forward, there's more work to be done in formal analyzing dress, physical dress, or how people are represented in images. But all this is to discover how gender expression and power structures can be transcended. Yes, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Bredar, and my research project is titled "From Shame to Sovereignty, a Political Analysis of Female Embodiment." As a student of political science, I've spent many hours reading and thinking about what a good society should be like. And as someone who grew up in a world saturated with confusing messages about my body, I'm someone who's been subsequently confused as to what its value might be. So I came to the Keck Fellowship curious about the politics of my and some of my friends' experiences with body shame. Why were our bodies sites of disempowerment? And what kind of society indoctrinates its people with the idea that they need to change physically in some way? So my positionality as a researcher is someone with a personal history of a very common struggle. And from this place of origin, I try to broaden my lens as I trace the historical place of the female body as it travels in the political world, understand the socio-political consequences of body shame, asking if one believes oneself to be physically wrong, what the political consequences of this are, and finally asking what solutions might create the new paradigm, a paradigm marked by bodily sovereignty. So let's begin. In the Western political tradition, the body politic is conceived of as an organism, a leviathan really, created by all the little citizens which make it up. And these citizens have theoretically given over some of their liberties in a social contract in order to gain from being part of the larger whole, which is more powerful. Specifically, the organism, the social contract, is made up of the rational minds of the citizens. Bodies and minds are dual, separate entities, and the body is considered unimportant. However, in his seminal piece, Body Politic, Bodies in Politic, theorist Charles Mills critiques social contract theory's denial of bodily reality. He writes, "Gender and race have no place in the story. They are irrelevant material accretions that can gain no purchase on the glossy, frictionless conceptual surface of idealized abstract individuals," which of course is a nice idea, but the experience of being embodied is inescapable. Early social contract theorists were genuinely unsure if a female rational mind could exist due to women being particularly embodied, their materiality making them poor candidates for inclusion into the social contract. Aristotle writes of the female as a deformed male, able to give to the offspring the body, but lacking the soul, the rational, which comes from men. Theorist Carol Pateman's analysis of the social contract is that it lies on top of a more fundamental sexual contract, in which the female body is a commodity possessed and exchanged by men via contract. This is a market good rather than a sovereign entity unto itself. So the social contract abstracts from the body, despite it being the very site of political empowerment and disempowerment. And women have attained much of the legal, civic individuality they were once denied, but we still find ourselves in a world in which female bodies are ranked and valued for aesthetics, shamed or praised accordingly, leaving the people inside to wonder at what real power they might have. And to be clear, this struggle with embodiment is by no means limited to women. However, I find that the power differential between genders and the historical context that women inherit renders them particularly vulnerable to messages linking their civic worth and purpose to physical appearance. So having laid out that background, my biggest question in this research was, how does seeing herself as insufficient shape a woman's understanding of her power? What are the political consequences of body shame as a cultural practice? And I find that through harmful, degrading messages about the body, the embodied feminine figure is still controlled and excluded from full participation in the body politic. Simone de Beauvoir wrote in 1949 that one is not born but becomes a woman. She writes about the socialization young girls receive, the encouragement to, quote, treat the whole person as a doll, a passive object, an inert given object. And to Beauvoir, the consequence is an inhibited intentionality, the exuberance of life restrained. Have things changed since then? Author and professor of political science, Melissa Harris Perry, offers us a helpful tool to understand the psychological implications of race-gendered tropes on Black women in America. In her book, Sister Citizen, she describes cognitive psychology research, which places participants in a room with crooked angles and in a tiltable chair and asks them to find straight up and down. And more often than not, participants found themselves leaning at askew, but believing they were straight up and down based on their visual field. As much as we'd like to believe we can find intrinsic truth, this research shows us just how heavily context dependent our cognitive processes are. And Harris Perry argues that race and gendered tropes work in the same way. They are the crooked rooms which skew people's perceptions of their own humanity. So for Black women, Harris Perry identifies 4 crooked images confronting them on TV, in the media, in the news, in conversation, workplace, daily life. Each trope has an accompanying embodiment, which is naturally at odds with the bodies of real people. So there is the mammy figure, a rolling, asexual, obedient person, not a threat to the social order. There's the Jezebel, whose body and personality are hypersexualized. easy. There's the angry Black woman whose grimace is overly emotional, disruptive. And lastly, but just as constrictive, is the trope of the strong Black woman who's highly educated, emotionally stoic, who conforms to the picture of female professionalism, appropriately body size, hair straightened. According to Harris Perry, there are two ways to survive what these crooked images tell you. One is to overcompensate, to try to self-correct despite not knowing which way might be up or down. And the other is to believe that the room as it is the truth, to accommodate the crooked images, to understand them as unremarkable. And this is the tragedy of the images that we see. To accept them is to deny the intrinsic truth of multidimensional personhood and citizenship. Harris Perry recognizes that the feeling of failure associated with manipulated images is shame. Further, the imposition of an impossible standard creates a market endlessly propped up by the weakened self-concept it creates and the products that promise to cure it. So these are the diet regimens, the workouts, the cosmetic surgeries, the injections, even the preset filters for your Instagram posts. Once you have it, that perfect, beautiful body they promise, you will be self-actualized, important, and powerful. But what are the costs of believing your body to be a project, and your most important one at that? I find it's a tenuous, conditional self-acceptance. The confidence that women describe feeling at their goal weight is powerful and real. The experience is enticing, both for its social reward, but also for its sense of self-mastery, of having achieved something difficult and rare. Beyonce, who sings, I slay, I go off, I go hard, take what's mine, I'm a star, also describes an extreme diet she went on before performing at Coachella and why it was supposedly necessary to change her body shape. Quote, it took me a while to feel confident enough to freak it and give it my own personality. This is confidence that is conditional. And what happens when there's a failure to achieve or maintain that ideal body? Diet culture tells you to blame yourself, that there's a lack of self-discipline, that something in you intrinsically is wrong. What about for athletes? Perhaps there's power to be found there in the achievement of feats thought once capable only by men, or the ability to alter your physical surroundings. I'm going to read you a quote which graced the pages of the New York Times in February. Skier Jessie Diggins won a bronze medal at the Olympics, and columnist Matthew Futterman had this analysis to contribute. In a sport that has so many women with massive shoulders and thighs, Diggins looks like a sprite in her racing suit, and it's not clear exactly where she gets her power. The words massive shoulders and thighs invoke a feeling of being in a butcher shop, and they call on the insidious ideal woman to come and shame so many of her compatriots for being so large, so massive, and so material. In one sentence, Futterman perfectly captures the catch-22 facing women, female athletes in public. Diggins is described as physically smaller than her peers, good, yet this apparent compliment is immediately spun into a question about her physical capabilities. His struggle to understand a woman's power and how it might exist differently in Diggins' body versus in the first and second place athletes beautifully illustrates the crooked rooms that police physically powerful women just the same. It's the compulsion to criticize a female body for bulk, which is intimidating, masculinizing, perhaps even rude. And for reference, these are the women that Diggins was racing with that day. So it's not clear to me that her body is extremely an anomaly compared to her compatriots, but for those who do achieve, whose bodies are that ideal female form, supermodel Emily Ratajkowski writes in her new book, My Body, about the tension she experiences between her real self and the images of her sold and owned by men. Marxist socialist feminists describe this phenomenon as alienation. Emily's body is the product of her labor, which she successfully sells, but then loses sovereignty over in the process, which creates fractures within her sense of self. And when the poet Eve Ensler sees images like Ratajkowski's, she writes, "My body will be mine when I'm thin." This is her expression of alienation, her visceral lack of ownership over her body as it is. She has sovereignty only over the quest for a thin body. My conclusion is that this person who holds this narrative of the self is unable to view themselves as a citizen in the fullest meaning of the word, as a powerful human actor with sovereignty over themselves, who allows themselves to be governed, who is ruled and rules by turn. To submit ourselves to the social contract, we must have something of value to hand over. And what might that be? What solutions create the new paradigm? So abstracting to focus on the human gifts of rationality, creativity, and social relationships are all important to remind us to get beyond the physical, but they risk throwing us back into the world of bodily denial. Analogous to racial color blindness, the "what matters is on the inside" message is perhaps premature. A lofty goal, we have more dirty work to do before we can reevaluate. To quote theorist Claire McKinney, a more honest relation to the body would require an appreciation that human value is created through striving for a future that does not merely replicate the past, but that recognizes the impossibility of leaving the past and our bodies behind. This is Sonia Renee Taylor, and in her book, The Body is Not an Apology, Taylor offers the power, both personal and political, of radical self-love, which asks us to divest from systems which rank bodies as superior and inferior. Taylor doesn't ask that you throw away your makeup. She just asks that you affirm your intrinsic value before seeking its validation in the external world with its crooked images galore. I also find promise in intuitive eating, a movement amongst nutritionists that teaches people to eat and exercise in ways that honor the body's hunger as sacred, without guilt or self-hatred. So intuitive eating makes sacred the simple experience of being hungry and nourishing oneself accordingly, which for women who struggle to see themselves as physically worthy is a radical act. And I believe the daily practice of tuning into the body and meeting its needs works to re-empower and reappropriate it from the crooked realities which police it. Ultimately, I've learned that the political revolution really begins in informal spaces, in the way that we raise our children, in the ways that we conceive of our own selves. And this is ultimately what drives people into the streets to say, I need better. And you have to have some sort of self-belief in order to do that. So how will the new generation of women who embody their intrinsic value, who are unsaddled from body shame, radically alter the world? I think that's something worth thinking about. So I'd like to thank the Keck Fellowship and the coordinators, Lindy Villa and Dr. Diaz, Brian Clack, the director of the Humanities Center, and my fellow Keck fellows. And most of all, Dr. Karen Shelby, my advisor, who helped immeasurably with this entire process and has really been such an amazing mentor for me. So.
Join us. Let's turn this off. Let me just get a quick another round of applause for these amazing presentations. So wonderful. So we have about 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes of our Q&A. So if anybody has a pressing question, we'll go ahead and talk into this mic so that everyone on Zoom can also hear us. I saw some of you all writing down some questions. I know they're important, so I'm going to give you all some time and space to do that. Questions?
Just a question that invites some conversation among yourselves. how would the sublime or any of the other ideas, how would it intersect with ideas or concerns like, for example, social justice? How does this come together?
Sure. Thanks for roping me into that discussion. I felt alone in my topic. Just off the top of my head, and with a huge bias toward environmental science, I think part of the potential implications of like broadening this kind of discussion and making it more popular, and part of what we talk about as, you know, a collective, is that you end up saving these kinds of places and valuing places for what they are and kind of also what they were. And I think that as a side has the added effect of helping the people that are there, you know, instead of turning the unconquerable into the conquered, you know, you kind of give it its space to become what it once was. And then everyone can enjoy it more.
I also think with that, in the conversation about what the sublime is, it's an encounter with something that is dangerous and uncomfortable. And I think that can be seen also in these social justice issues. It's about going to these spaces that push you to be a different person, to a better person, to benefit the communities and the common good. And I think that's where I see the most overlap between the sublime and these social justice issues as well.
Yeah, great. Any other questions, comments? Okay, well, as you all are, oh, sure, yeah.
This is for Claire. What would be, in your opinion, the gold standard of a society that promotes like physical health and well-being without creating like this culture of shame or hierarchy?
That's a great question, Luke. I mean, I've thought about it. No, I don't think I need that. Oh, is this better? Okay. I think that the emphasis and what I'm trying to get at with a lot of my research is that the image and the focus on aesthetics is what's really pernicious. And that's like, has to do with the ownership. So I obviously am an athlete myself, and I totally believe in like living a healthy lifestyle. But it's about like the goal society is like one in which athletics are not at all linked to like your social worth, and people are allowed to just be human. And in like, sorry, my words aren't coming out great, but yeah, so be the multidimensional people that I kind of was referencing. So be a really strong athlete, but also be weak and vulnerable at times, and like have different skills and weaknesses in different areas. And like a space in public, as I mentioned with the Jesse Diggins quote, like the need to comment on a body as for its like difference, basically, rather than just the focus being on the achievement itself. I think I find an issue with that. Can I answer your question?
It's a question for Bryson Patterson. In engaging with the sublime on a grand scale as a society, how do you think that would best be? What's your best vision of how people kind of enter that space? Is it through individual interactions? Is it through perhaps like education? Or yeah, what do you think?
I think looking to the past, kind of seeing when it began and then how society took it and ran with it is interesting. If you try and look at parallels of, okay, we have this book, we're going to make all this art, and we're going to paint all these things, and then we're going to go explore every part of the planet that exists, like just for the sake of exploration. I think that leads you to some really interesting answers. I don't want to sound like I love Elon Musk or anything, but you know, I think it makes us look up to the stars, and I think that is an interesting part of it. And I think we live in a very different society now than when this was first popularized. And so I think investments in science and trying to unravel just the mysteries that we keep discovering is really something that you can kind of get the whole world behind. And I think it's important to do it in artistic ways. I think that's what worked the first time. And I think that's what inspires people to, something you can consume in your house that then convinces you to go get outside of your house or, vote in a way that tries to unravel those mysteries.
Others?
I have two questions. Claire, I've spoken with a ton, so Claire, I'm not going to ask you a question here. Okay. But I guess I have one question for Bryanna, and it has to do with the way that you were invoking hierarchy through kind of materiality, and then seem to almost be invoking androgyny as an answer to materiality. And I guess my question is, would you, in overcoming some of the challenges of embodied hierarchies within gender expression emerging from Catholic theology, would you push us more toward an amped up materiality where the multiplicity of materialities helps us to overcome the hierarchies? Or would you move us towards something that is an invocation of that Middle Ages androgyny that attempts to diminish the differences? So that's question number one, and that's for Bryanna. Okay, I'm going to get them all in while I can here.
No.
Okay, and then Bryson, I'm going to ask my question too, and then you all can manage it. Bryson, when you were speaking, I couldn't help but think about the way in which the sublime is this conquering of that terror and horror in distantiation from it. And then thinking about your invocation of a scientific conquering of nature, that the embrace led to this scientific conquering of nature. And then, of course, the idea that that will to conquer nature has led us even further to the horrors nouveau that environmental movements are trying to confront. And I guess I'm trying to think about how, yes, we can conquer nature. Pesticides are the answer. And, everything is just a mess, right? And that's changing our materiality. And now that's what the horror is. And we need to distantiate ourselves from that. And so I guess I'm just trying to ask, is that part of the new sublime? And how do we deal with the effects of that original sublime where science, trying to conquer science leads us to something new? Okay, now I'm stopping. Thank you all for fantastic presentations.
Yeah, that question gives me a lot to think about. When doing my research, it did seem that given the body and gender is not metaphysically tied together, and then considering that God is this idea of nothingness, at first it led me to think so pursuing androgyny would be a better or the best way to somehow engage with the divine more. But I don't think that should in any way come from a force of everyone should be androgynous. I think it should primarily just be an acknowledgement that and I don't know if I'm at the place yet, and I don't think the world is ready for just a release of gender. So that's ideal, but I don't think that's plausible in the next coming years. So I do think just starting with an acknowledgement that our bodies can do so many things, and when we express it, it should participate in this fullness of the divine. I believe you had another part about engaging with materiality. I think that can come with embracing material culture and embracing clothes. That does still carry social history, but it's just a part of our human expression. So I wouldn't want to deny anything that also denies human creativity. So, yeah.
That's a hard question. Yeah, thinking about how you go from this book in the Romantic period and all of the things it spawned. I don't associate the sublime with we messed up the planet, but like I can see the path you took to get there. And what I focused on in the sublime was really I took Burke's book and I took the Romantic period, and then I took my photography. I skipped all of the other iterations of the sublime that have come up. There's a book, I think it was called The Geographic Sublime or something along those lines, that Dr. Clack, Dr. O'Shea, and I read. And it talks about all sorts of new sublimes that like would have been unfamiliar to Burke, looking at cities and architecture as things that are sublime, looking at technology as something that can be sublime. I think the role it plays in getting out of this mess, I'm hesitant to think that it's what caused, I think it's what caused us to put roads in national parks, but I'm not sure it's the same thing that caused us to, expand out west as hard as we could to mine as much gold as we could. I think it's not entirely to blame for, where we are right now. But I do think it's something that could lend itself to getting us out of it. I think, I had a really nice picture of some of those wind turbines up in like a foggy mountain in the middle of Timbuktu. Like it was absolutely not something anybody's really going to see. But I think being able to kind of capture things like that and just remind people that, wow, I'm enjoying looking at this thing. It's less alien, it's less unfamiliar, taking these things that we need to be doing and just making them a little bit less scary, hopefully to the point that you can enjoy it. And then you're back at the sublime.
Thank you all so much for that engagement, for our presenters again, for sharing so much of themselves and also their work. So we're going to take a quick 10-minute break, and you can please encourage you to kind of talk to the presenters a bit more about their work, and definitely invite you to come join us for our second session. Really fantastic, another set of 4 really fantastic presentations. Okay, so thank you all again. Okay, let's go ahead and start. We have some exciting presentations for us today. So welcome everyone. My name is Josen Diaz. I am a faculty member in the Ethnic Studies Department, as well as a chair of the Collaborative Research Program here at the Humanities Center. I want to thank you all for joining us today for the Interdisciplinary Humanities Research presentations. Before we begin, I want to say just a little bit of something about the Keck Humanities program. So for the entirety of the academic year, our Keck Fellows work under the close guidance of a faculty advisor to conduct original, substantial research, scholarly activities, and/or creative work, all of which are really instrumental for advancing the Interdisciplinary Humanities program here on campus. So this year, I had the immense privilege of working with and learning from 6 Keck Fellows. Some of them are in the audience right here. So whose work in the interdisciplinary humanities, I think, represents the best of undergraduate research here at USD. So to that end, I want to thank Brian Clack, of course, Lindy Villa for their instrumental support for the Keck program. Jesse Mills, who's helped to usher in this cohort, to Dr. Fukan, Amanda Makula, who met with the fellows during our monthly meetings, and to the faculty advisors for guiding the fellows for the entire year through the process of research and writing. And of course, to the fellows themselves for easily being the very best part of the program. So now I want to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Fukan, to say a little bit more about the Interdisciplinary Humanities program.
Actually didn't want to say too much about the program. Wanted to thank you all so much for being here. It's delightful to see mentors. Thank you for staying, Brian, for the entire presentation. The Interdisciplinary Humanities program is a small residency program. We keep it intentionally small. And one of the unique things about it is that students can create their own curriculum out of the humanities, and they spend an entire year in their senior year doing research. We'd love to privilege creative projects, so you'll see 2 samples of very creative out there projects. I'm not sure if Alyssa and Karlin will be presenting their photo essays and some of the other artistic stuff they've been doing, but it's really been my pleasure to work with you both this year. I've learned so much. Thank you to the Keck Fellows as well for inviting us to this presentation. And always thank you to the director and assistant director of the Humanities Center for inviting us to be a part of this annual presentation. So I think we're just going to start the presentations and we'll do Q&A afterwards at the end. And our last presenter will be on Zoom, right? Thank you for making that possible, by the way. Thank you all.
First up, we have Alyssa Mugavero, Karlin Bergum, and then Thomas Sanbeg, and then Fanisee.
Is this like how you click through the, oh, I got you.
Okay. So, hello, my name is Alyssa Mugavero, and I'm a double major in Interdisciplinary Humanities and Sociology. The title of my project is Can We Get There from Here? Improbable Possibilities for Empathetic Change. My project is about how language frames and shapes reality. About 4 years ago, I came to the university with a question that I've been trying to answer for a while. This question was, what is love? Initially, I began to search for an answer through things I could see, moments in everyday life and media that showed expressions of care and concern through the very embodiment and action of it. Looking for these visual representations, about 3 years ago, I began to walk around campus and various other public and private spaces between San Diego and LA County with a camera, searching for kinds of tangible evidence of what love is that I could capture. What I found through these photos weren't answers to what love is, but rather a series of realizations. I first realized I wasn't a good photographer. I was very much noticed. I didn't blend into the social scenes I went into, especially with a large lensed camera. The camera became a kind of object of disruption. I then realized I was fascinated with, or I liked and appreciated, the camera's ability to disrupt. The camera's gaze and even surveillance caused momentary instances and spaces of self-awareness in others and in myself. Its presence ultimately reorganized, readjusted, and reframed the interactions between us, between myself and the one I was taking a photo of. Lastly, I realized that there was something here. The very act of taking a photo served as a brief moment of exposure that caused the person and or people in view to ask me, what are you doing there? And what does this have to do with me? So I would tell them, I'm trying to capture what love is. They didn't quite understand what I was doing, and I myself didn't quite understand what I was doing then either. This interaction, excuse me, created the space for both of us to question how we thought about love in relation to how we express our love to others and how love is generally expressed around us in the world, in our social enclaves and our neighborhoods. These are my first photos, and I asked them what love is, and they performed it for me. So, Michel Foucault identifies these brief moments as ruptures in a system that causes us to momentarily question the social and also economic structures of our livelihoods in his work, Archaeology of Knowledge. I see these ruptures as linguistic structures that highlight and hide the desirable and undesirable aspects of our lives. In other words, these ruptures are linguistic because in each iteration I encountered of love was expressed, it was understood and experienced in terms of something else. For example, I heard love as dedication, love as sacrifice, love as frustration, and my favorites, love as expressions of who one is, and love as reflections of how we see the world. Through these various metaphors of love, where love is predominantly understood in terms of romance, it became evident that the metaphors we use to think and speak about care and concern for others were not conceptually prevalent and even at times fully existent within the metaphorical framework of love as romance. Ultimately, I was trying to find the evidence of things not seen, to borrow from a title of one of James Baldwin's work, because when I first asked the question, what is love? I did not consider how the dominant metaphors such as love as romantic highlight and simultaneously hide particular realities over others. in the same way that Baldwin tries to excavate the meaning of the word community in his work I reference. I set out to excavate the meaning of love as something alternative and or different from relational romance. So I was introduced to the term empathy by my mentor and advisor, Dr. Floyd, which was an attempt to get closer to try to discover the evidence of our endless connection with and responsibility for each other. So that's a quote in the Evidence of Things Not Seen. As empathy is commonly referred to stepping inside someone else's shoes, I first understood empathy to mean something that I resonated a lot with, and in a way characterized the social disparities that came along with my own compromised domestic upbringing, which normalized violence, substance abuse, and an apathetic disposition towards others. In Tupac's song, Nothing to Lose, he wrote, "Do or die, walk a mile in my shoes, and you'd be crazy too, with nothing to lose." And this song, Tupac touches upon real instances of suffering that exposes the poverty that bothered him. And because of this, he prayed to God every day, but he said he didn't listen. The song goes on to express the realities of having to face and cope with the consequences of social inequities. As Tupac continued to write, "Am I wrong with wishing I was somewhere else? I'm 13, I can't feed myself. Can I blame my father because he left me? Wish he was there to help me. Too much like his father, his mother didn't love him." In this sense, I connect and relate with Tupac's understanding of empathy because I myself have lived similar realities. And the unbearable reality of it all is that such a life of poverty, substance abuse, and or social and racial inequities do lead to crazy conditions that many do not survive and cannot persist through. However, the question that arises is that if another has not experienced the social disparities of poverty, violence, among other disparities, are they capable to understand and experience the physical, emotional, and mental realities of such life conditions and outcomes? Often we get a kind of phrase or variation like, "Well, I'm not you, and I cannot thus understand how you feel, and well, we're all unique," with the implication being that it's impossible for anyone to understand truly the experience of anyone else. My point here is not to argue the validity of these assertions, for quite frankly, they are most likely partially true as our current language frames this kind of reality. But my point is to suggest that they are, however, at the same time, partially false, misleading, and present significant obstacles for any work predicated on empathy. In a world where empathy appears to be much needed and is based on shared traits of feeling, understanding, and experience, empathy cannot exist in a world in which our ways of shaping ourselves as wholly distinct individuals who are separated from another, because this frame of thinking banishes empathy from existence. I want to make a note here that as I continue that I'm switching from I to we, as these thoughts are formulated in a team-like effort between my mentor, Dr. Floyd, and I. Both these statements above are connected by current notions of what we call terminal uniqueness, but also suggest the reaches and limits of the term terminal as a kind of endpoint, a closure, an untreatable, inoperable condition, or in other terms, an already an accessible endpoint to empathy, presumptive to its beginning. We are thinking here of something like a safety or shut-off valve designed to kick in before too much or empathy or any empathy can build, which is seemingly already codified in our language and thought, how we think and how we speak. Before continuing, I should make it clear that I'm following a line of thought evident in metaphor theory, if not anywhere else, which holds that metaphors are central rather than peripheral to language, and that they reflect thought and shape action. The metaphors which we speak may be less obvious, but one might be the person as a machine, and hence our use of the term safety or shut-off valve. Another metaphor might be the person as a unique, discrete entity. A person as a self-contained ecosystem might be another way of thinking about the second metaphor. The person as a snowflake, also a notion that one hears from time to time, also fits this mode of thinking as well. All metaphors above pose problems for empathy, a term we define as the capacity for understanding and experience how another person understands and experiences. For one, the former metaphor of a person as a machine immediately rules out any sense of emotionality whatsoever, and thus any possible emotional connection. We cannot yet attribute emotions to machinery, although it might be possible in the future. So far as we are aware, machines have not yet acquired emotive capabilities, although such might be possible with artificial intelligence. Snowflakes don't seem to have emotions either. But perhaps more importantly for this metaphor, the point might be that there isn't just one snowflake in the world, but rather a plethora of them, making the individual flake part of a collective, a point that seems generally ignored when a person as a snowflake metaphor arises. The point is here that uniqueness is only truly unique when there is no other likeness in existence, when it shares nothing with anything or anyone else. And while this state might exist somewhere, it's hard to see such in snowflakes or people, given the plurality of the term themselves, or terms themselves, excuse me. So perhaps we can't truly understand and experience exactly what another person understands and experiences. But do we need that level of exactitude? What might our reliance on the metaphors noted above tell us about our sense of our own limits? Our argument is that we can't get to a place of empathy from here, whether we want it or need it. Our question is then, where do we go from here? What can we do to bring into our world something that seems so desired by the term's constant existence in the past few years in media feeds and in journals and upon everywhere else, you know, as we were still living a pandemic. And so the question becomes, can we get there from here? Which suggests that we need to really look at the metaphors we're using and see if they suggest an empathetic worldview. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge the College of Arts and Sciences for supporting my research. I would also like to give a thanks to Dr. Floyd, even though he couldn't be here. I saw him earlier today, it was wonderful. And Dr. Buchan and Dr. Reifer for all their support. I'm not going to get emotional, so thank you.
Hello, my name is Karlin Bergum. I'm an interdisciplinary humanities student, an emphasis in art, and my thesis title is called The Intricacies of Creatorship, Pseudonyms, and the Masquerade. To explain, I will start with identity. Identity makes up the core of my project, specifically how identity informs the creative design process as it provides a basis of ownership and culture over an articulated look and or styling. Hence the term creatorship. Creators draw upon themselves, their being, to find originality and creativity. Their identity is forged from a particular compilation of experiences, morals, preferences, and it is unique to them. And when they express themselves creatively, that outward expression is unique as well. Their design expression has an identifiable signature as an individual, or as individual as the person who created it. That style signature becomes an extension of the creator themselves. So where am I going with this? Clothing inherently carries with it a convoluted rituals of identity, immersion, and expression. Individuals and fashion designers draw on their being, their experiences, their emotions to create a style that can be readily discerned. That identifiable style can become synonymous with the specific social demographics and ideologies that foster cultural bond in the people who partake in that style. Famous legacy brands such as Chanel, Fendi, and Dior are perfect examples of how designers whose style is so iconic and definitive can foster a sense of community in the wearers that is so strong that it can be seen as cultural in nature. Culture is thus defined as the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. These fashion cultures have nuances and histories that bond individuals within it. Now, I want to clarify that my project is a little playful and perhaps a little controversial, but I feel that it could spark some much needed reflection on the design environment of the fashion industry. With that being said, for my project, I have started a discussion on the parallels between cultural appropriation and design piracy. I am looking at how ultimately there is a systemic issue of identity appropriation in the fashion garment industry that is perpetuated due to the disassociation of fashion styling and design from the individual creators behind them. Cultural appropriation takes place when members of a majority group adopt cultural elements of a minority group in an exploitative, disrespectful, and stereotypical way. So all garments have imbued within them the expectation of understanding of a culture in its entirety. The nuances within the garment's styling choices tell a story about a person based on their social placement in a specific society. To an outsider, these nuances are lost or ignored, diminishing the power of the garment to the greater social environment. So how exactly can this play out for legacy brands? Well-known legacy brands such as Chanel, Dior, Fendi were founded by a designer that is now deceased. These deceased designers fostered specific brand identity, styling, culture based on their own identity, and yet since their passing, there have been a multitude of different designers who have taken up their design mantles. These new designers had to slip into the shoes of someone else and learn to create through an identity filter that is not their own. They had to appropriate the original designer's creative identity in order to design. This whole process is endorsed by the brands themselves, yet somehow there's a difference between the successors and the independent designers who do the same thing to capitalize off design identity and the culture of someone else. For example, when a design is ripped off or copied. So how can you really define a legacy brand garment, say like a Chanel tweed, for example, as authentically Chanel? What makes a garment authentic to a culture or an identity? Can it only be authentic if made by the individual who originally created it? Is it deemed authentic based on the use of approved materials, techniques, and environments? When is a design modified enough to not be considered theft or appropriation? Are research and knowledge the keys to authenticity? And how can a line really be drawn between acceptable appropriation and unacceptable appropriation? So in order to discuss these questions, I've decided to make my own fashion collection. Two of the garments are traditional cultural inspired or appropriated garments, the Indian sari and the Norwegian bunad. And then the other two are inspired or appropriated from the popular designer legacy brands of Chanel and Fendi. Within the garments, I have incorporated specific elements and details that symbolically align with the various aspects of my topic, including identity expression, theft, appropriation, inspiration, copying, and more. I'm currently not finished with the collection, but the collection will be completed at the end of May, and I'll have a catalog, which you can view if you'd really like to. But for the sake of time today, I'm just going to walk you through a couple design elements that I've used, like meant to spark discussion on some of these ideas. Firstly, I'd like to talk about the use of printmaking plates to create a pattern on one of my garments on the textile. I wanted to use a combination of plates made by myself and by strangers. When I was talking with my mentor, Bill Kelly, about it, he was concerned with my use of other plates. He was adamant about the wrongness of it and the potential of getting in trouble for it. Because I didn't make that work. I have no idea the context behind that work. I don't have the permission to use it as my own, but that was entirely my point. In the United States, in terms of intellectual property rights, it's fully legal for me to use a stranger's plates as long as there's at least one thing that differs from the original. So I could literally slash a plate and make one line and I can call it my own. I can overlay the image with something else and call it my own. So this happens every single day. Creators are blatantly utilizing others' work, yet see no repercussions. In fact, it seems that consumeristic culture actually encourages the ripping off of others' identities and cultures as a means of making the exclusive accessible, especially in the fashion industry. How else can this be seen? So I've decided to weave a Lesage tweed for my Chanel outfit. Gabrielle Chanel was a fashion revolutionary who started designing in 1910. She introduced the first women's wear suit, drastically shifting the style away from conservative corsetry towards practicality and comfort. And she utilized many aspects of menswear, including the use of tweed, which has never been allowed for women before. Her tweed suit became highly copied, and in response, she began to design her own tweed fabrics called Lesage tweeds that were so complicated that they cannot be replicated by factories due to the use of alternative materials, unique colorways, embellishment, and the sheer expense of weaving it. It was these Lesage tweeds that defined whether or not the garment was authentic. My Chanel suit will be cut and sewn from a Lesage tweed using proper techniques, embellished with authentic Chanel buttons, and will even feature a Chanel garment tag on the inside. So what exactly is keeping my Chanel suit from being considered as authentic as the Chanel suit designed and made by the current creative director of Chanel, Virginie Viard? We've both done the research, understood the brand culture, and have mindfully designed it as if we are an extension of Gabrielle Chanel herself. So what or who is the authority to decide what is allowed or disallowed when it comes to appropriate or inappropriate inspiration, appropriation, admiration, emulation within the world of creatorship and fashion? And then in closing, it's a few of the process photos that I've had from weaving the tweed to draping and pattern making that I've done for the garments. And then I also have my plates and a sample of my tweed with me, which I can show later, or I can grab it now. Okay. Sorry. So this is the tweed. Plates with me as well that I'll be using to print my fabric from. Some I have done and some are not mine. So yeah, thank you. Yeah. I missed it like 4 times.
Hi, everyone. My name is Thomas Sanbeg. I'm going to be presenting my account of cultural appropriation that I've been developing, and I've been calling it the group authenticity account. First things first, though, as was kind of alluded to, cultural appropriation doesn't necessarily need to be a wrong thing. In the way I will be employing language, I will be distinguishing cultural appropriation from cultural misappropriation. And my account will attempt to explain how we can distinguish between these two things. I trace the, I think in the mainstream, there's this connotation that comes with cultural appropriation that it is a bad thing. And I think this shift in the language largely comes back to the sudden thrust that cultural appropriation faces as it's put out into the mainstream. So prior to 2014, cultural appropriation was largely just a concept that was talked about within academic circles. But after 2014, I think it was around one of the Kardashian appropriation events, it really takes off and doesn't look back. The search interest in Google has climbed steadily since 2014 and continues to remain fairly high. One of the most common arguments typically employed against cultural appropriation within the media is what philosophers have called claim deference arguments, where the kind of assessment of a particular act of appropriation is deferred to the cultural group whose practice is in concern. And so claim deference arguments afford this solidarity with potentially marginalized communities as they retain the ultimate authority over whether or not their practice can be appropriated in a way or whether it should be objected to.
I'm going to skip this slide for simplicity's sake. However, the challenge with claim deference arguments becomes apparent at the level of sub-agential groups, which is a group without a democratic mechanism in place for arriving at group decisions. So with claim deference arguments, it's assumed that there's a way to arrive at what the group's consensus is on a particular instance of appropriation. However, when there's no democratic mechanism in place for arriving at this group consensus, the voices of a few individuals within the group can be mistaken as representative of the group as a whole, of what they think as a whole. In granting claim deference arguments can lead to polarization within the appropriation debate, as with claim deference arguments, if all it takes is one voice to object to a particular instance of appropriation, the barrier for objecting to appropriation is set very low. And so this, in effect, devolves into a kind of universal restrictiveness, with the idea that cultural appropriation across the board is impermissible. It's a blanket condemnation of cultural appropriation. And this, I do not think, is a tenable position to hold in a globalized context. One of the facets of a globalized world is that cultures will exchange various practices and intermix in a way. However, at the other end of the spectrum, we have universal entitlement, which similarly, I don't think is a tenable position to hold. Universal entitlement suggests that any appropriation is permissible. You can't object to instances of cultural appropriation. I don't think this is right, though, and especially given that objections to cultural appropriation usually derive from a concern for colonization, in that the Western world has already taken land from so many minority communities, and now the concern is that the Western world is also taking cultures from these minority communities. So what we need with our account then is some kind of middle ground between these two polar oppositions. So primarily, we can't have an account that presents some kind of blanket assessment. So it's either for or against appropriation. We need an account that's able to add some nuance to the conversation and kind of discern appropriation from misappropriation on a case-by-case basis. And then furthermore, we need an account that appeals to some kind of independently grounded rationale. With claim deference arguments, we typically see appeals to what the group whose practice is in concern, how they feel about it. However, to make our account more philosophically robust, it's important that our objections to cultural appropriation appeal to some kind of independently grounded rationale, which might be an empirical statistic or some kind of line of reasoning that suggests why this instance of cultural appropriation is wrong. One account proposed by philosophers is called the intimacy account, which it defines cultural misappropriation as when an outsider misappropriates from the cultural group such that the cultural group's intimacy is violated. And to help explain this account, they appeal to an analogy between interpersonal relationships and group dynamics. So just as, let's say, two friends might come up with some kind of dance that they do that's unique and authentic, and that they themselves have created. If they all of a sudden see some acquaintance down the street doing this dance without their permission, that's going to be a little off-putting to these two friends. It's going to violate their intimacy that they've created, or the sacredness of that practice that they've managed to create. And so these two philosophers say something similar happens at the group level when, let's say, to stick with the analogy of a dance, when outsiders maybe appropriate something along those lines of a dance, some kind of cultural practice. It can violate the group's intimacy and the sacredness that's created through engaging in that practice. So while the intimacy account, I think, has get some things right, it ultimately appeals to, as we've seen, appeals to this idea of expressive rationale. It's ultimately a group's feelings that are to dictate if their group's intimacy has been violated. With my account, though, what I'm calling the authenticity account, I suggest that intimacy itself, though, is derivative of authenticity. Intimacy is not going to arise out of practices that are inauthentic. So to come back to this analogy of a dance, if the practice that a culture group is engaging in is the electric slide, intimacy is not going to be available through that practice. That practice needs to be original. So what I try to do then is say that intimacy is not in concern, but authenticity. And so cultural misappropriation occurs when an outsider appropriates a practice in such a way that it offers unsolicited variations in a group's practice. And this argumentation looks something along the lines of when an outsider misappropriates, they're kind of imposing themselves upon a cultural group's practice by offering variations in that practice, and thus that group's culture. So ultimately, misappropriation threatens a group's self-determination. One of the initial objections to this account that might be too restrictive in the sense that it seems you could deem any appropriation as a misappropriation insofar as appropriation by definition assumes some kind of a reproduction. However, my account will maintain that a reproduction is wrong only when it offers unsolicited variations in a group's practice. So this is to say that one can engage in reproduction so long as they're adhering to a certain kind of standard that has been established by the cultural group whose practice they are reproducing. And this provides a means through which we can engage in productive cultural exchange through cultural appropriation while retaining some kind of respect for the cultural group who we are appropriating from. Here are my sources, and that's all I have for you.
Good morning, everyone. Let me know if y'all can hear me. I know Zoom people can hear me, but I don't know if, oh, okay. Oh, Lindy said yes in the chat. Y'all throw it back to 2 years ago. I'm facilitating this whole Zoom thing right now. Okay, so it's kind of weird because I can see myself on the screen in the room, but it's totally okay. I hope that works for y'all. I'm also going to share my slides, right, Lindy? Or do you have the slides you wanted to pull up? Okay. Perfect. I wish I would have cleaned my bed a little bit. Hold on, y'all. Okay, so bear with me, please. I'm so sorry. I am not able to make it physically on campus right now. It was like literally last minute, but I am still more than excited to present my work and to have any questions, comments, concerns. My dad's on here on Zoom, so shout out. I'm a little bit more nervous now, but I think that just means that I'm super passionate and excited about my project. I also can't hear y'all as like an audience. And so I might be a little bit awkward because I like the feedback, but there are two people in the front. If you want to like do snaps, claps, I can see y'all. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Slideshow. Is that good, y'all? Cool. I love this. Okay. Accessibility. Okay, for sure. Hybrid. Thank you so much. I don't know whether to start or not, but I am going to start right now. It seems like it's good to go. Maybe not. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Fanisee. I use she, her pronouns. I am a graduating senior, and I'm so excited for these next couple of weeks to be presenting my project, not only at this Keck presentation, but also just with family and friends, and just kind of also using it as a tangible legacy piece. A lot of times I explain my project as a 4-year, like 4-year-long research project, really because I have been doing this work, not only personally, but professionally. And so it feels really nice to be able to feed two birds with one hand and really just have things interconnected and intersectional. And so I really appreciate y'all for being here and wanting to even listen to this undergrad research, especially when it's almost at the end of the semester where we are just burnt out. So that being said, I'm going to try to give y'all all the energy I can today from my dorm room, but it definitely would have been a little bit better in person. This first slide right here is my poster. I did use it for the undergraduate research conference, and honestly, I fell in love with it. Maybe it's just the colors, the color scheme, I don't really know, but it's super beautiful. Just kind of be able to see where my project has gone and what are the key insights, as well as what is important to reflect on and what is important for the future. So as much as I'm kind of explaining my paper and my project, I will also be explaining like personal experience of how this project has proceeded and how it has gone for me, which is a part of the research as well. We always, or at least I, for methods and data, I always love anecdotes and stories and personal experience. I feel like that's, for me, definitely resonates and hits a lot harder than data or numbers. And so I just wanted to show y'all the big synopsis of my presentation. And then I wanted to go into like the different parts of my presentation. And so first, I don't know if Dr. Reifer is there. I cannot see you, but shout out Dr. Reifer. He is in the sociology department and he is my mentor. He's been, I would say, my mentor for also like at least 4 years. I really appreciate his support and just ability to like see the best in literally everyone. I do appreciate the patience and the motivation that Dr. Reifer has given me throughout this project. That's really something that is key to doing the research, is knowing that you're supported through the research. And that's at least the number one thing I felt with being with Dr. Reifer. And I know that when I came to him for this project, it was very much, I was given agency and I was also given like the support. So I had no idea, as a first generation college student, I had no idea what I wanted to research. But when it came down to it, I was like, passion project, right? So I'm super passionate about disability justice. I also have a disability myself, a physical disability. I'm connected in higher education, although I am a first generation college student, and I'm a sociology major. So what I did was just basically was like, find someone that supports me, and was like, how can I connect all three of these huge and amazing and influential topics, such as higher education, sociology, and ableism / like accommodations and disability. Shout out to him. Thank you so much. I just wanted to give another great big shout out. Doing research with agency is super important. And that's what's kind of motivated me throughout the whole process. So let's get into it. Let's get into my first kind of approach to understanding this research question and understanding my research in general. And so I will be talking about the purpose of my research, the purpose of why it's so important, and really like the purpose of understanding what it means to be in community with people with disabilities in higher education, and how we can incorporate that in sociology, whether it's academic sociology literature or whether it's through sociological communities. So my research question essentially is, and in many forms comes out to be, how can people with disabilities find human flourishing in higher education? So as my title explains or reads, marginalized communities struggle for eudaimonia, people with disabilities in higher education. So eudaimonia just means human flourishing. That's me trying to be academic, but also that's me looking at the literature and the research that has been done to understand what human flourishing can mean. And the more research I was doing on human flourishing and on understanding identity and sociology and community, honestly, the less I was finding research and I guess focus on people with disabilities, and in an intersectional way, right? So not just people with disabilities and looking at only their disability, but people with disabilities and understanding that they have multiple perspectives and identities and stories and connection when it comes to how they want to flourish as a person with a disability. So for speaking for myself, like I'm a person with a disability who is also low income. And I know that some of my peers have disabilities in higher education specifically, and they're not necessarily low income. So they might not have the burden or extra challenge to pay for their wheelchair or pay for their translator if they have like a different ASL translator or something like that. So just understanding, what does human flourishing even mean? Like starting there. So I have words on the screen and I'm not always going to read them fully just because I'm more of an impromptu person. But you're more than welcome to, if you are able to, read them on the screen and kind of infer from there. But I will also, like I said, kind of go with my perspective of outside of what's on the screen. So I'm specifically interested in tracing the alternative history of the recognition of issues with people with disabilities. So like I said, what are the gaps in sociology? So I've also read a lot of sociological papers, or even have resonated with and felt connected to sociologists who do this type of work. And then I find myself being like, okay, what about this? Like, and specifically, what about disability in sociology? Like, are we just in sociology? Are we just focusing on race, class, and gender? Or are we going out of the box to be intersectional as possible? And what I mean by intersectionality, hopefully y'all know that. But if you do not know, it's coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's basically summing up the interconnectedness and like the many and multiple perspectives and identities that you do have. So like I said, I'm not only a person with a disability, but I'm a person with a disability who's low income and who's also first generation. That's going to be a different experience possibly than a person with a disability who is not first generation and not low income. And so understanding that there are alternative and erased histories that are just not in the archives, they're not in the awareness, they're not in the mainstream, whether it's media or articles or journalism, because whether it's like loss of that history through not being able to archive it, through violence and oppression and marginalization from institutions. What I'm trying to say is history has been lost. And a lot of times, as we know with other projects as well, it's come about that like that history has a dominant perspective, and whether it's white, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual, male, and fill in the blank, it's still history that we are holding up to of importance, which also holds up the systemic oppression and like systemic oppressive stereotypes that continue in our world today. And so really what my research is just trying to incorporate disability and identity and those perspectives as much as possible into research that has already been done, but understanding like, oh, hey, we have another perspective that we can add onto this. So not really reinventing the wheel of like, let me go back to whenever humans were humans and say, what were people with disabilities like? I have no idea. I really can't even go as far back as sometimes even the 20th century, because people with disabilities were, trigger warning, I'm going to be talking about murder and death and people with disabilities getting basically like tormented by state violence. But I'm going to try to not be too like explicit about what's happening. Read my paper for more of that. But basically just understanding that people with disabilities to a certain extent didn't even have like agency or rights until the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I do kind of want to go into more of that history as well, and understanding that like there is history that we don't know about and that there's history that is not brought to our attention, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I do want to go into my introduction piece of the presentation, just understanding that I'm introducing the idea of like marginalized communities and disability and ableism. And this is not solely coming from me, right? It's coming from the literature reviews and the research I've done, but it's really like basic understanding that people with disabilities are in the community. And I hesitate on saying that. And I even feel a little bit uncomfortable saying that because it seems so whatever, obviously we know that, duh, but that is not the case. And I know from my personal experience, I have felt like, oh, there's probably not people with disabilities in this room, or, oh, there's not people with disabilities in this room. And usually people do not think about catering to or supporting people with disabilities unless it's explicitly like in front of their face and they're met with like, hey, I need this accommodation, or hey, I'm disclosing to you I have a disability. So this quote means a lot. It comes from Rebecca Coakley, a senior fellow for the disability policy at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. But There is not a civil rights issue today impacting marginalized communities, honestly, anyone, that does not have a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities. So just that understanding that we are not trying to play oppression Olympics over here, being like, people with disabilities are the #1 people harmed. It's like, no, they are harmed. And that's the first and foremost thing that we need to say, because people don't understand that people with disabilities are harmed at such a rapid rate and such a like racialized rate as well. Specifically speaking on like Black people with disabilities are increasingly more targeted by police brutality than other folks who don't have that identity. So just understanding that it is a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities, and understanding that this happens across the globe for marginalized communities across the globe. Let me just say that again. This is a global issue on oppression and privilege and identity and systemic violence, honestly. So how can we flourish together? How can we have more human flourishing versus like human rights and surviving? How can we go beyond just surviving and just getting rights? Like I said, just having the Americans with Disabilities Act is not going to cut it for human flourishing. It's just not going to do it. Just because you have you are forced to have a ramp at your restaurant for me does not mean that is the only thing that you can do for me to make me feel safe and comfortable. Next slide, I just want to talk about the significance of not only like my research question and the research, but also just the significance to understand for y'all, for your awareness of how you do define yourself, how you may be limited in defining yourself because we only have language of particular systems and particular areas. For example, I statements again. So I have the language of living in the United States as a disabled woman of color, fill in the blank, fill in the blank. And I noticed that what my language was and how I defined myself when I lived in rural Idaho and versus when I came to higher education in San Diego. Let me just hold on. Let me put this in perspective. I don't know if y'all know who or what Idaho is. It's a state that I used to live in. It has 1 million people in there. And we all know that San Diego has 3 million people in the city. So my language was very much limited. My idea about disability was very much limited. I had known no one really else with a disability besides my cousin that was like a physical disability. And when I say that, I'm going to stop myself right here because I also want to understand that I may not have realized I engaged with someone with a disability because one, maybe it wasn't visible. Maybe it wasn't physical. Maybe I just didn't understand when I was younger that mental health and diagnoses like bipolar and autism also can be under the umbrella of disability. So that's what I'm trying to help y'all understand is this, it's really significant what quote unquote defines you and your experience. And honestly, it can change up. The more I'm authentic with myself, the more I'm authentic with understanding what academia and society and professors and people in power have to say to me, and how they even label me in the words they use has sometimes helped me define myself. And so, for example, when I was younger, I was like, I had this internalized ableism of like, oh, I'm going to get better in 6 months. Like I was in the hospital, I'm going to get better. I'm going to get better. And it was like, I don't have that opinion now. I don't ever feel like I need to quote unquote get better, especially in higher education. I don't ever feel like I need to compare myself to others. But let me just say that's because I've gained such a grit, such a resilience, such almost even like a numbness to the ableism in higher education. And let me also go back on that. The significance of understanding like language and definitions, it can be seen as semantics and it can be seen as very crucial. And we know that even some words, saying them differently, saying in different contexts can mean a lot. When someone says, oh, I see your handicap placard, I don't have a rise in myself of when someone says, oh, are you handicapped? That's definitely very much different of how you might label someone, define them and define their experiences. And so I also, in my research, I will be talking about, I noticed that sometimes I'm using words that might not be even accessible to y'all that might not know disability justice terminology, but ableism is understanding similar to other isms and phobias, but understanding that you are basically valued on your ability to do things and you're kind of devalued on your ability to not do certain things. So favoring able-bodiedness and favoring able bodies and even typical minds. So yeah. anyways. So let me go on to my next slide. Also, if someone's in the chat, if they can give me like a time boundary, I actually have not been checking too much, but I think I'm still good. I want to go into like the methods that I had used. This one was a little bit harder for me to vocalize or write down because I wanted to use so much in my research. Like I wanted to interview everybody, anybody. I wanted to do so many surveys, and with the way the time was looking and the way, you know, just really everything like comes about with the end of the kind of like your research. It was a lot to, again, recreate the wheel, but also I was able to use experience professionally and personally over the past 4 years to really add emphasis and like an oomph to my project. So like I said, I've been working on this for almost literally 4 years, and going into it, it was not easy by any means, but it was definitely very much like naturally I was passionate about it. So it's really awesome to work on this. So for example, here I have sociological theories that I bring up. I have personal experience and observations, literature reviews, interviews and focus groups. Some of y'all may have even been in them that I've done over the past, not only year, but the past 4 years. Alliance of Disability Advocates. So like spaces like that, I've been using collecting data and stories and scenarios and examples, and even from different centers on campus. So such as the Disability and Learning Difference Center and the Student Affairs Center. They all very much have an insight on how people with disabilities and how students with disabilities can flourish in higher education, because they have students each year that they're working with. And in general, I just wanted to say, like, it involved like the liberation of like, hopefully most and everybody to like kind of share what liberation means to them is what I wanted to get out of these different methods. So with my reflection, I know I'm coming up on time right now. With my reflection, I really understand like this question of human flourishing and like the full effective participation in society. Like how do we point towards that? How do we have that be our goal? At the end of the day, it's always in the back of our mind. So I want to end off kind of on this basically statement, and it goes back to language and terminology, but a lot of times we're moving towards equality, quote unquote. It's in documents, it's in very significant documents, not only for the nation, but for even universities and things like that. A lot of people emphasize equality, and therefore people might be treating you fair, but what we want to shift to is the narrative towards interdependence, codependence, and collaboration. And that can be sought from interactions, support, and understanding people with disabilities, even if you don't, one, see them in the room, know they're in the room, or they were invited to the table. They should always be at the forefront of our decision making. And this kind of goes to this quote I want to end on. The quote reads, "Nothing about us without us is for us." So the slogan, this powerful slogan, came from the struggle of people with disabilities in South Africa. It could be the basic operating principles of people's struggle all over the world, and it really is. Nothing about us without us has been on the rise with disability just movements and disability rights solidarity. But just make sure to think about that. When you are in spaces and you're either doing research or you're trying to make decisions, understand that nothing can be done without people that you're trying to serve and people that need to be served. So nothing about us without us. As a person with a disability, this research means so much. And this research I'm doing is for the community, and it won't be done without people in the community. Thank you all so much again for listening. That is the end of my presentation. I appreciate it so much. Shout out. I will be on Zoom for the questions as well. Feel free to email me anything you need for clarification, any solidarity. I'm not here for a long time, but I'm definitely here to help in any way I can on campus. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we can take some Q&A. You can see me, right? So let's take some questions from the audience, from each other. I think that would be important too, from our advisors. Does anyone have any questions for any of our panelists? Maybe let you marry. Yeah.
I have a question for Karlin. I think the idea of researching and then making something that's evocative and representative of what you're researching is really neat. You mentioned the difficulty in the original Chanel tweed, and that's kind of what makes it authentic. So I guess I was just wondering, like, what challenges did you have when you were trying to come close to that authenticity? Because I would assume that that would also include an extreme challenge of replicating that.
Well, oh God. Okay. So in the process of making the tweed, I had to find the materials, and I had a lot of trial and error with like the yarns breaking, the way in which a tweed is woven is it hurts your head after a while because there's so many threads, and then you have to like remember, and you have to go back and forth, and you have to there's a weird pattern that's really hard to see after a while. So there's a lot of messing up that that happened. And then you have to make sure that the tension is right. And then you have to keep the pattern. Like there's a lot of like little nuances and little things that are just like so frustrating. Like that little piece that I had took me almost like 20 hours. And that was just that little piece. And needless to say, I probably will never do it again. But it was an interesting experience. So yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Comment?
So I just want to thank all the presenters. Even though I've been with the two of you this whole year, I saw new things to your project. So I thank you all four of you. So I think because I've been with you for a year, I'd like to ask Fanisee and Thomas mostly. Because I think one of the things I'm seeing in all of your presentations is kind of working around issues of identity, community, and of course, compassion. But they're also rooted in this assumptions you're all making about the meaningness of authenticity in your projects, which, it's kind of mentioned, but it's not sort of things that you elaborate on. So for Fanisee, I wonder, how that would fit into your project, because sometimes what happens when we think about equality is like whose experience is the authentic one that defines the basis of inequality, right? And so for Thomas too, where does authenticity play in for you? I loved what you were saying about the intimacy that's being broken, right? So if I could ask both of you, Fanisee, if you'd like to start first. And thank you all again so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for the questions. I love the engagement. Absolutely, period. Absolutely, authenticity is like almost the blanket, like moral of the story, I think, for my project. And it's a little bit hard, I will be transparent, defining authenticity, because as much as I feel like I'm an authentic person and I try to be myself, I do realize I have a tendency to maybe code switch when I'm in certain places, or I have a tendency to overexert my energy when I know that myself as a disabled woman, like I need to take rest and I need to take breaks. And when I don't, I know that I'm not being authentic to myself. So it's a little bit hard because as much as I want to practice it and preach it, I don't hold people to it as much because I know that it can be hard to be authentic, especially with having a disability and disclosing your disability. So that's why I haven't really like pinpointed in my paper or anything or in my presentation, because I understand that at least within the disabled community there's been community guidelines, let's just say, so to speak. Everyone has their own identity and their own understanding of individualism and how they may identify. And there is this saying in the community of like people first language. So whatever they want as like being labeled or being, disclosed as a disability or not, it's a little bit hard because people want to be authentic, but spaces will not allow that authenticity. People want to be able to take mental health breaks because they're neurodivergent or because they're mental health issues, but they can't do that authentically because they have things like assignments and higher education that's kind of pushing them to be this like non-authentic, like run-of-the-mill best undergrad student they can have. So I think in higher education, it's a little bit hard to see authenticity, but it's super important for agency.
I think for me, like authenticity is ultimately what's at stake with cultural misappropriation. I think historically, like the Western world has had this way of, going into places and taking what they want and disregarding things they don't care for. But with cultural practices, like I think a huge element of them is the context and the intentionality behind them, and why were they initially performed? How did these practices come about? But if we just promote this commodification of certain cultural practices, where it's just you're getting a element or a portion of a practice, ultimately if you take that practice out of context, it's just gonna lose its significance and turn into anything else that can be purchased on the market. And so with objecting to certain instances of cultural appropriation, I think what's at stake is the preservation of some kind of authenticity to these cultural practices. And I think these various cultures and their various practices are important because they give this colorful display to humanity and the diverse modes of humanity that have been expressed on this planet. And insofar as we can retain the authenticity of those cultures, we retain something that I think is valuable and we'd be missing if we allow this kind of homogenization of culture across the globe.
Other ones? Well, I have a quick question that I think is related to a bit to Dr. Furkan's. I think all of you are, one of the things I noticed was that each of you is thinking about relations in really interesting ways, whether it's relations to others, right? Love, thinking about culture or fashion, appropriation, disability, right? That they're ultimately different ways of relating, or different methods with which we can understand relationships to one another, to each other, to even to land, right, to people. So I'm wondering if you all could speak a little bit more about how you're imagining your own project as offering us new ways of relating to ourselves or to each other. Or we could just end. So what do you all think?
One thing that's interesting with cultural appropriation is that it requires you to establish like some way, like cultural appropriation is a concept that relies on this insider-outsider distinction. You have to identify who is a cultural group member and who's a cultural outsider. And that was super interesting to think about, especially in a globalized context. Like I think traditionally, like if you think about Black culture, like you think about it operating along racial lines, but in a globalized context, I don't know that promoting this kind of segregationalist position is like a tenable position. And so it's interesting if we aren't defining group membership along things like race or ethnicity, how can we come to reevaluate the standards we use to kind of distinguish cultural group membership from cultural group outsiders? And so, yeah, that was one of the most interesting things of like maybe redefining what it means to be a part of a certain culture. Can you come to be a member of a cultural group that maybe you weren't born into, but through engaging with them and maybe learning about their practices and the history behind it, could you kind of come to attain yourself some kind of insider status?
Yeah. So I was thinking about, yeah. Right. So, so I was thinking about each of your presentations offering a different mode of thinking about relation, right? Relation to each other, relation to land, relation to things. Right? So I'm wondering how your specific project offers us a new way of thinking about relations to each other.
Well, I guess I'd say something about like the antithesis of that. What I think personally, what happened in my own life and my own upbringing was that you automatically get excluded from certain types of in-groups or out-groups. And you come to a point where you say, well, now what? You know what I mean? You're impoverished, you got violence, there's substance abuse, you know what I mean? And then you really say, well, now what? You know what I mean? What, and you see your parents struggling, you know what I mean? And then you say, okay, well, I could be like them, but I don't want to be like them. And so for me, thinking about other people, it came to a point where I, in myself, understood that there are other people out me like there that aren't being seen, they're not heard. And, you know, in my life, all I was looking for is someone that cared, because there was an absence of that all around me. And obviously I have a abundance of it now, and I'm very blessed. But when we think about others, we often really do think about, well, it's my individual struggle. And because that's the world makes you, it creates you into it, it puts you in there, you know, you are alone are struggling, especially as children. And so my work on empathy in relation to seeing ourselves as interconnected and not truly unique, but similar to one another, came from, or I imagine it because of something I lacked, and I see a lack in others. And if we really, which I don't think I'm really honest, I don't think we want a world in which we love each other, or that we're empathetic to one another, because we monetize things, you know, we want to make a buck. And so we need a transition to, we want to make some empathy, you know what I mean? We want to make some love. And so in any case, there you have it.
Thank you. There, Karlin or Fanisee, do you all have anything to add?
If I could go, sorry, Karlin, not to cut you off if you're gonna go. I mean, Alyssa really did that mic drop right there. I'm not even trying to hype you up. Like, empathy is at the core of my project as well, and it's really highlighted at the core of my project because sympathy is so ingrained in a connotation when it comes to people with disabilities. Like, I feel bad for you versus, okay, I understand you, how can I help you, you know, type of thing. Or like, how can I be in community with you, you know? So I love that Alyssa was talking about the idea of like individualism versus collectivism. I definitely understand that my project and research in the humanities in general is a lot about relationships. I think you can't really like move around it, like, because it's so interconnected. And even relations and relationships with, like you said, like the land that we're on, or relationships with our bodies, not even just like who we are mentally and who we like identify as, but like physically, like what is our bodies, like what do they encounter and what does that mean for us? Individualism versus collectivism. So understanding that it's not only like your issue to solve, and it's not only your issue that you're going through alone, but like understanding that there is underlying like solidarity across like beings. Specifically, let's talk about human beings, and just understand that our relationships with them really curate like every other interaction and maybe decision that we allow in our daily lives. And you could even maybe say the butterfly effect, and something to that extent. Like, if we didn't have this type of relationships, it might not curate other type of relationships. So in my project, I'm just really helping people understand their relationship to our bodies, and also relationship to like how we enter a room. So not only the physical space of like, is that door accessible? Can a person with the wheelchair come in the room? But also mentally, like, who are we thinking about and who are we not thinking about? If we're talking about an issue like police brutality, are we only thinking about like the white disabled people, or are we thinking about a whole bunch of different identities? So the relationships we have with people, and the relationships we have with ourselves and our mind, and the way we can be authentic is super important to my project and many projects we have here.
I have a kind of question. So actually it's interesting because all the presentations kind of circled around, I think, something. On the one hand, you have this inescapable heterogeneity, the snowflake thing. But in a capitalist consumer culture, we're advertised that as separating ourselves. We can't connect with each other because we're so unique, But of course, you bring up the snowflake example, and that seems kind of ridiculous, So I was wondering if you could, and simultaneously, we have this neo-fascist emphasis on us all being the same and hating other groups of people who are different. And those things actually are seen as different, but they come together. And I was wondering if you could expand upon that, especially to challenge you, because you talked about this thing about capturing love. And I have a problem with the capturing part because it seems that that's the one thing you can't capture or contain, And isn't that the unassimilable, the heterogeneous,
Thank you for challenging me. I know, I really appreciate it. Okay, so Susan Sontag, who's a photographer, says photography is a violent act. And I agree. Photography is very violent. It disturbs and it's very you see it takes pictures without offering a hand, you know what I mean? And in the sense, you see a starving child in Africa and that's you have a photographer taking a picture of it, but you are on the other side of a Life magazine. It's what do I do about that? And so Susan Sontag, a photographer, says it's very violent. Unfortunately, how we capture pictures is we make photographic stills of them. And so for me, I think, which I try to touch upon in my first presentation, is talking about violence. There are different iterations of love, such as love as romance, but there's also love as violence. And that would have tied in better with me trying to capture love, because in a way it was reminiscent to, I'm kind of struggling with your question a little bit, but you don't think so? Okay. I don't, not to say that it doesn't exist, but I think, yeah. Okay, well then I remember you reading a book, I think it was a couple Wednesdays ago, where it says the search for the human soul. And it was me and Dr. Floyd, it was us. And I said, I wouldn't even know where to begin, right? And then Dr. Floyd, as he said, well, some things aren't lost and you don't really have to search for them. And so are you saying similar to that of love? Mm-hmm. I would refer to that, but I don't, any case. Next question.
Yeah. Just wanted to thank again. I don't know, Fanisee, if you can hear us somewhere. Thank you so much for all of your presentations. Really, they were so fantastic. So just another round of applause.